really excited all of you are here. We've spent a whole month together already. It's pretty amazing. We're already in our second month. This is class 5. We're going to stop counting how many classes at a certain point, but just it's good to take time to mark, I don't know, I think good things, and studying text together is a good thing. We've spent the last few weeks talking a little bit about Talmud, what it is and how it functions, at least a little bit, with a focus more on sort of story, the kind of materials that are focused on sort of reading between the lines, right? We talked about last week, we looked at a couple of texts about longevity, which are really not about longevity. They're really about what do these rabbis think are important in life. And before that, we talked about the concept of ona'at devarim, of verbal fraud, or what does it mean for the power of our words? And before that, we talked about sort of encountering the real world and how we learn Torah from that. And so we've spent quite a bit of time on these more sort of broad, generalized concepts. And so I wanted to dig deep in this week and try and do something a little different, a little bit more technical. So it's very likely that we'll probably do this week and next week. So be ready to be disappointed by no answers at the end of today. Talmud will rarely give you answers. But I think it's important because, when most folks think about Talmud or approach Talmud, they're doing so with a sort of a knowledge or awareness that there is a legal component, right? That the texts are talking about law in some way. And so I want to sort of offer the following framework when we think about law and Judaism, halacha, Jewish law, and how it shows up in the Talmud. So first of all, the rabbis are very clear that that Jewish law and sort of articulating the boundaries of one's action applies basically to every element of our life. I mean, they talk about going to the bathroom, they talk about holidays, they talk about relationships between people, business, all there are no subjects that are off the table, right? The rabbis understood that we don't relegate living or Jewish living only to holidays or only when we go to synagogue or something like that. Jewish life and Jewish living is a part of every moment of every day, right? Halacha is really about the process of Jewish decision-making, if you will. And so what I want to sort of understand when we study Talmud and halachic texts in particular is that the rabbis are really interested in fleshing out an idea of understanding, well, how can we refine this idea to be as sort of narrow or as specific as possible, right? So today we're going to talk about the power of intention, right? Whether or not intention is required. Well, there are a lot of circumstances, and we'll talk about only about 2 of them today, or today and tomorrow, or next week rather. And so the rabbis, what they'll do is they'll sort of throw up an idea, and then they'll sort of beat up the idea. They'll offer challenges to the idea, and then resolutions or rejections of those, whatever. I want to sort of offer the importance when we talk about like sort of the takeaways, which is very rarely in the modern era do we take something said in the Talmud and apply it literally. Now, the Talmud is really important when it comes to Jewish law, but 1,500 years of Jewish conversations have continued since it ended, since we stopped, the Talmud stopped being, it was canonized. And so it's really important when we look at the Talmud, not that we should ignore it, certainly not, but that it is an important part of the conversation, but not the end of the conversation. Is everybody with me on that? The nuance that I'm putting there? Okay. It also is that the rabbis are less concerned about a particular answer as opposed to understanding how can that answer be consistent, right? So the question of does intent matter is the subject matter we're going to talk about today. Rabbis don't have a clear answer at the end saying, yes, intent matters, or no, intent doesn't matter. It'll be up to individuals or camps of folks who will say, well, yeah, we think that's the case, and here is our arguments, and we've beaten up those arguments as best as we could, and this camp says something else. And so I want to sort of just offer that as a salve to the end of saying, well, what's the answer? Because the rabbis are not interested in the answer. As I said to you last week, and a few weeks before that, the Talmud is very much like a pedagogical tool. It's about us, the reader, its relationship to us, the reader. And so we have to ask ourselves at each stage, what is the Talmud trying to teach us in this text? It might be a conclusion, sometimes that happens. It might be a process. It might be fill in the blank. And so we have to just be thoughtful about what that is. Okay. Everybody with me so far? Any questions about what I've said so far? Cool. This week is going to get a little technical. So we're going to go slow. We're going to make sure everybody's on the same page. And it's okay to disagree with the rabbis. Like they don't own ultimate truth. But we're going to try and understand at least what they have to say on the subject. Okay. With that much longer introduction than I intended, I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see this okay? Give me a thumbs up if that's the case. Awesome. All right, I'm just going to move you so I can see everybody's face as best as I can. It's very helpful for me if you use the raised hand function, which is under the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, at least on desktop. On mobile, it's somewhere else. That's very helpful for me since I'll do my best to sort of see you waving to the camera, but I won't always catch it. Okay. We are in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, one of my favorites. Masechet Rosh Hashanah is about the various points in the year in which we start the counting, right? So imagine the difference between the calendar year and the fiscal year and the religious year. All of those things are different new years in the calendar, in our modern calendar. And Rosh Hashanah is ostensibly about that, as well as the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, but it's about holidays in general and mitzvot, and it sort of goes off on many tangents. In this section, we're going to ask ourselves the question, do mitzvot require intention? That's the question. We'll skip a section in the middle where it talks about punishments and stuff. It doesn't really help us, but that's the section. This is what we're going to study today. I want to point out a few important terms that I think will be helpful. One is this term, it's going to be really essential for us, is this word yatzah. So if you're sitting at home and I know that everybody's muted, you can say it. I won't, nobody will hear you. You can practice saying yatzah, which is the verb meaning to go out, right? You go outside the house, you yatzah. Okay. In this context, in the context of mitzvot, the word yatzah means to fulfill an obligation. Right? So imagine it as the metaphorical checking of a box. Did I check the box? That's what the word yatzah means. Now, the other half of that equation is that one is obligated. So the rabbis are presuming that there is an obligation, and that obligation has to be dealt with, has to be resolved. Now, the word for obligation, chayav or chiyuv, the verb and the noun, also carries with it a sense of liability. If you don't fulfill the obligation, you're liable to it. That's the section around punishment we're probably going to skip. But that's an important piece of this element. Okay, so we're going to see the question yatzah. And so the question will be whether or not it's yatzah, they fulfilled the obligation, right, or not. Okay. The other word I want to point out to you, at least in this first paragraph, is this word here. Can everybody see that? Where it's highlighted, where it says vahatanya. So we talked about a few weeks ago that this word Tanya introduces a text called a baraita. A baraita is a Tanaitic source, which means it comes from the Tanaim, which are the earliest rabbis. Right, so think Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Meir, Hillel and Shammai, they're Tanaim. And Tanya introduces a text that didn't make it into the Mishnah, but is still sort of authoritative of that time. You can see the word baraita highlighted here. This hey, at the beginning, is called an interrogative hey. What it means is, it's a grammatical term that introduces a question. So when you see the hey, you should assume a question mark at the end of the sentence. And so when you see vehatanya, we should understand it to mean, well, wasn't it taught in a baraita? You can see it here. Isn't it taught in a baraita? It's sort of like a rhetorical question. We're going to tell you, but we're asking it as a question. Okay. It's important to get these little technical terms, because as you read the paragraphs, in the future, in the next class, you'll see this word, v'hatanya, and you'll know, question is coming, or proof text is coming, or baraita is coming, or something along those lines. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read this first paragraph for us in English? Anybody want to start? I can start picking on people. Okay, I'll read. Oh, Nelson, I see you unmuted. Go for it.
Isn't it taught in a baraita with regard to someone who was at times sane and at times insane?
No, sorry. I'm sorry. Start here.
Okay. Is it related that the following ruling was? It is related that the following ruling was sent from Eretz Yisrael to Shmuel's father. If one was forcibly compelled to eat matzah on Passover, he has fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara clarifies the matter. Who compelled him to eat the matzah? If we say that a demon forced him, that is, he ate it in a moment of insanity, this is difficult. Isn't it taught in the Baraita with regard to someone who is at times sane and at times insane? At the times when he is sane, he's considered halakhically competent for all purposes and is obligated in all the mitzvot. And when he is insane, he is considered insane for all purposes and is therefore exempt from the mitzvot. If so, someone who was compelled by a demon to eat matzah is not considered obligated to perform the mitzvot at all.
Awesome. Thank you, Nelson. Okay, I'm sure all of you presumed that demons were going to show up in this paragraph. I know that you assumed that. Okay, there's a lot to unpack in this paragraph. So let's start at the beginning. So first of all, just as a reminder, the bold text is the translation of the Aramaic to its left, or in this case, probably mostly Hebrew. And the not bold is Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary, right? It's the one that's sort of just helping us understand what's happening. So we start off with something that was sent to Shmuel's father, right? So a teaching was sent. And the question we have to ask is, where was it sent from? In the Talmudic era, the teachers who were in the land of Israel and those in Babylonia were in conversation. And so teachers, Ula is a famous example, are going back and forth, sharing teachings across, right? So imagine, right, you've got a school in Israel, a school in the United States, and each of them are sending people to share teachings in the other school. Okay, that, sort of using modern geography. So first of all, that's interesting, right? So we're getting a sense of what is happening in the land of Israel during this time period. Second, here's the case. If someone was compelled by force to eat matzah on Passover, right, that person has fulfilled their obligation to eat matzah on Passover. First of all, like what kind of circumstance is someone forcing another to eat matzah? And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the case? And that's what the rabbis are always trying to do. They're trying to figure out, like, what's the scenario, the situation that is going to bring this into play? And here the answer is, well, a demon forced them. Now, the demon part is fascinating, and we're going to actually, we're not always going to read the note, but I love the note on the side here, and we're going to read it here, and I'm just going to read it. Right, so what does it mean that a demon forced this person? This phrase describes a circumstance where an individual is forced to do something unwillingly as a result of a temporary state of insanity. Here the word insanity is being used in a very non-technical way. Later in the discussion, this state is compared to all other cases of temporary insanity, where at the moment of insanity, the person is not considered to be aware or responsible for their actions. In such a state, one is not obligated to observe any mitzvot, or any that they do observe do not count. Meaning to say, under the circumstances, using the analogy of a demon and sanity, is, do I have the capacity to do something with intention? Am I doing so willingly? If I am unable, and here it's using the sort of context of a demon, if I'm unable to make a choice, right, can I fulfill an obligation if I didn't choose to do so? The rabbis seem to say, right, when you have the choice and you're able to make an intentional choice and you have intention, then you are able, then you are sort of, it counts. If you are unable to make that choice, you are not capable of intending something, then you are not obligated. That's what's happening here. We're talking about whether or not someone is obligated, right? So we haven't gotten quite to the fulfilling part of the obligation, just the existence of whether or not one is obligated. Does anybody have any questions about this? Thoughts? We don't know if the rabbis really believed a demon forced them or somebody else, or something more medical involved, but that's certainly the language we have here. Yeah, Bill Satin.
So of course, what's not understood is who's making the determination on them being sane or insane, or what is that criteria? And is it a circular argument if they were somehow forced to do a mitzvah that they maybe would be known not to, or is it an odd time, or in this case, it's matzah during a time when you're eating matzah anyway? Would they simply say, oh, they must be insane to be doing that? So anyhow, that whole question of determination is a hard one.
Yeah, right. We don't have the part in the Breita where it says, go ask the psychiatrist to do be an expert in this case, right? So the question of whether or not they are, I think the rabbi certainly would say, sort of in response to that, which is like, we trust the circumstances of the moment. If someone feels like they are unable to make this decision because they're incompetent, I mean that in a very technical sense, maybe we can do that. There's a parallel conversation about hunger and Yom Kippur that shows up in the 8th chapter of Masechet Yoma. Maybe we'll read that one too, about someone who is basically incapable of thinking clearly because they are so hungry and they eat something on Yom Kippur, right? What is the circumstances there? So it's just an interesting parallel.
But you're saying, so it would be personal testimony. Someone would say, gosh, I did it, but I wasn't, essentially I had no intent to do it. There's no observable that would be relied upon.
So look, I don't know exactly if the rabbis would say, let's bring forth witnesses and whether the witnesses matter or not. But I think the ability of the rabbis to know or our ability to know what's in somebody else's mind is not something we're capable of, right? So we have to trust the circumstances we have available. Bill Schwartz, Nelson, and then Bob Leeson.
If you're sitting around the Seder table and you eat a piece of matzah because everybody's eating it, are you forced to, or are you just eating it because it's there?
Yeah, so I think the circumstances here, I think they're imagining like physical forcing of eating matzah, not peer pressure. They're talking about, and as we'll read in the next paragraph, which I'm going to do right now, just because that way it'll add some flavor, and then Nelson and Bob will come back to you. Rav Ashi said, I'm right here now, we're dealing not with a case with demons, but in the case in which Persians or some other population compelled him to eat, meaning to say, put the matzah in your mouth, or we'll kill you, which is a sentence nobody has ever said, right? Rava, we'll come back to Rava, right? So here, Rav Ashi is suggesting, actually, you were compelled by force, right? Someone's going to say, I'm going to skewer you with my spear unless you eat the matzah, right? Nelson and then Bob.
You might have actually talked about, I was thinking about someone who compulsively eats matzah all the time. And though you're not supposed to eat it before the Passover, at least the afternoon, he eats it on Passover because he compulsively eats matzah all the time as he fulfills his obligation. So that's like a demon because it's a compelling action. He never refrains from it.
I don't think that's what the rabbis are imagining, but I love the question, which is, right, there are lots of, let's use demons here again, colloquially, right? Lots of things that compel us, addiction and other kinds of things where we don't really have control, right? And I think that's a really wonderful question. And I don't know the answer, but we can, as we unpack the question of intent, we can sort of imagine that scenario also. Yeah, Bob.
From the other direction, if you have someone who is not capable of eating matzah, there would be no reason to force them to eat matzah to fulfill the requirement, because they can't or wouldn't. So having somebody who can't eat food, forcing them to eat matzah to fulfill the mitzvah isn't necessary because they're not required.
Right. So I think, right. So the question of someone who's not obligated and they're forced to do an action, did they check the box? And I think the scenario the rabbis are imagining are scenarios in which one is obligated, right? They're doing a mitzvah. The question is whether or not they're doing so with intention or like on purpose or not, right? And here we get another example from Rava. Here, I'm just going to read this paragraph below here, right? So I read Rav Ashi, right? The case is not demons, but in which somebody compelled this person to eat. Rava said, that is to say, right, creating an analogy here, right? One who sounds a shofar for the music, having no intent to fulfill the mitzvah, fulfills their obligation, since the critical issue is hearing the blast and not the intent of the blower, right? So here, and this is the case that we're going to spend more time with, rather than the matzah specifically, which is, if you hear somebody blowing a shofar who's not intending to blow it for the holiday, right, just for music, or maybe it's on the holiday and it's just for music, they're practicing, whatever, does that count as fulfilling your obligation to listening to to hearing the shofar? That's the case we're gonna hear. Bill Satin.
So these are both positive commandment examples. Do they address negative and understand how do you understand intent in someone not doing something?
Right. Every day I intend not to murder somebody, right? Have I fulfilled a mitzvah? That's a great question. This section I don't think speaks to that, but it's a great question to have in the back of your head, right? The difference between refraining from something that I'm commanded not to do, right? And therefore I'm always fulfilling it, which is a category of mitzvah, versus I'm commanded to do something and I then don't do it, right? Or do it whether or not that matters. Let's unpack this. I want to keep moving because I want us to have lots of information in which to do. Can I get another volunteer to answer this question, to read the Gemara's question? Anybody want to read for it? Yeah, Bill said.
The Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that this is identical to that which was stated above, that one who was compelled to eat matzah fulfills the mitzvah, even if he had no intention of doing so? The same should apply in the case of the shofar, that one who heard the blast of a shofar fulfills his obligation, even if he had no intention of doing so. The Gemara answers, lest you say that there is a difference between the two cases. There, the merciful one says, eat matzah, and he indeed ate it, thereby fulfilling the mitzvah.
Okay. Well, read the second half too.
But here, with regard to a shofar, it is written, a memorial of blast, Leviticus 23:24, which might have been understood as requiring conscious intent. And this one was merely acting unawares, without having any intent whatsoever of performing the mitzvah. Therefore, Rav teaches us that the absence of intent does not invalidate fulfillment of the mitzvah, even in the case of shofar. The Gemara concludes, apparently, Rav maintains that the fulfillment of mitzvah does not require intent. That is to say, if one performs a mitzvah, he fulfills his obligation, even if he has no intention of doing so.
Awesome. So here, we're now comparing the two cases of matzah and shofar. Right, which is to say, right, God says, that's what here it says, I'm skipping this part here, right? The merciful one, Rahmana, is referring to God. God commands us and says, eat matzah, regardless of whether or not the person wanted to or not. They ate matzah, therefore the box is checked. They fulfilled the obligation. And according, right, and now we're analogizing that to the shofar, right? In the text, it says Zichron Tru'ah, a memorial of blast, which you might have understood, according to Rabbi Steinsaltz, right, requires intent, zichron, memory. It requires something to go with the mind. No, according to the Gemara and our understanding here, they just were not paying attention. They were just acting, right? They weren't doing with intent. And so therefore, we can understand what Rava says as to say, mitzvot are more like a checkbox, and it doesn't matter whether or not you intended. You did it, that's the part that matters. Now, the conversation does not end here, but let's unpack whether or not people agree or disagree. Nelson, I saw you raise your hand.
Suppose one has a recording of a shofar, which one might presume that who's ever playing the shofar has no intent for the particular holiday that you're thinking about, you're confronting. Hearing the recording fulfills the obligation because it doesn't require intent. But there's no way, I don't think there's any analogy to the matzah case.
Yeah, so I want to bracket the example of a recording, because while it does come from the same section of Masechet Rosh Hashanah, it deals with a different issue, which is whether or not a recording is the same thing as the thing. And so I want to bracket that as a separate conversation. I think the question becomes, if I may rephrase your challenge here in a good way, right? Which is, can a mitzvah be fulfilled through a variety of ways, and do all of those require intention? Would you say that's a fair analogy to what you said before?
Well, it's much broader. I only thought about one way. There's lots of ways, I guess.
Right. Bill Schwartz and then Bill Satin. Ooh, you're still muted. Bill, we cannot hear you. Bill Schwartz, we can't hear you. You got to unmute yourself.
If somebody just hears the shofar, and it's not the traditional 3 tunes, just hears a random noise coming from a shofar, is that the same thing as hearing the shofar, or do you have to hear the right the tekiah, whatever, shwarim, teruah, or does any shofar noise count?
Ooh, such a good question, and particularly because the rabbis do ask that very question farther down. So I'm not going to answer it because no spoilers, but that is right. That is in line with the rabbis are asking. Right? Well, does it matter if it's the traditional blast or someone's just doodling on a shofar? Which is a thing I'm not quite sure I can imagine. But so I'm not going to answer, Bill. But that is one of the right questions to ask. There are lots of right questions. That's one of them. Anything you want to add?
Me, no.
Okay, great. Good question. Bill.
So I'm going to say there isn't one checkbox, but there are 3 check boxes around the mitzvah. It could be that God cares that you completed this mitzvah and only God would know your intention. It could be that you have to get something from this or not. But I'll also add a third category, and that is the community. So being seen fulfilling a mitzvah. And so it's possible that when we say we've checked off doing the mitzvah, perhaps it only has to check off one of those boxes. So if God knows, so let's take the scenario, someone didn't really intend to do it. God would know that, so you're not checking the God box. You would know it, and you can't check the you box. But guess what? The community is going to see a Jew fulfilling a commandment and go, oh, how nice. He's part of the community. This is what we all do. So you checked off one of those boxes, and maybe that's enough. I don't know.
Yeah, so 2 things. One is the rabbis definitely don't have that conception of multiple layers like that. But, and the second is that doesn't to say that we shouldn't, right? Which is to say that it's not as simple, right? When we fulfill a mitzvah, there are multiple layers to it, which you've identified a few of them. I'm sure collectively we could brainstorm and come up with even more, right? Which is doing the action enough? And I think behind your question, the argument would be, no, actually, it's not enough just to do the thing. You would disagree with Rava, I think, and you can tell me if I'm getting you right, which is actually, yeah, you might have checked the box, but you really didn't do it. And And I think that's a fair challenge, right? Which is Rava says, no, you did the thing, it checks the box, done, but others don't.
Actually, I would, with that scenario of it having value for the community, seeing you complete the mitzvah, I think that actually fulfills Rava's idea, that it's enough that it was done. It might not be enough for you, it might not be enough for God, but in this case, it's enough that being part of a community, they're seeing homogeneity in practice and the like. And so maybe that would encourage someone else at some point. So I think in that, my scenario, it actually would support Rava, even though that's not how he describes it.
Great. Thank you for refining that. Ron and then Bob.
I was thinking about it. I mean, there's what Bill just said about why you're doing it or how you, but there's also the rabbis say at some point you have to hear how many notes and what notes, and the same thing with the mitzvah, you have to eat a certain quantity. I mean, does that matter or does that not matter?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the example that the rabbis were giving about matzah, they're presuming that it's enough to fulfill the mitzvah in the very technical sense, right? I mean, say it's the right amount of volume. And in the shofar, at least so far, we can sort of presume that, shofar blast for whatever reason is resonant with, it's similar to the kinds of shofar blasts we're expecting. But as Bill Schwartz said before, right, and asked the question, oh, maybe it's not so clear. So yeah, I mean, those are great questions. I'm not answering them, but those are great questions. Bob and then Kathy.
I'm thinking about descendants of crypto Jews who have Jewish practices without being Jewish, who are performing mitzvot without even knowing that they are. I don't know how they fit into this, but they're out there.
Yeah, right. So an interesting question, right, of which is, do I have to know that I'm doing a mitzvah to do a mitzvah? Right? If I accidentally eat a piece of matzah and it happens to be Passover, did I fulfill the obligation? I think that would fall into the same kind of category here, right? If I do Kiddush and I'm just doing the words because they are a ritual I do, but it happens to be only on Friday nights, okay, like maybe I did fulfill the mitzvah. Yeah, Kathy and then Bill Schwartz.
Maybe you covered this before, so forgive me, but all of, excuse me, all of this makes me feel to think about what your conscience tells you to do. And I think an excellent example was the crypto Jews. I mean, obviously their conscience told them to follow a tradition without understanding what that tradition was. And I think you can do mitzvot, but in your heart, you're doing it because perhaps you feel you have to do it because your community expects you to do it. And I think that parallels with the question is intent. Does intent go along with your conscience?
Do you think so? Do you think intent goes with one's conscience?
I personally do.
Okay.
But yeah. I'm very faith-based in that respect personally. I think you do things with good intention or you don't do them at all because it's phony otherwise.
So would you then say that doing the action fulfills the mitzvah or no? Like, well, even if the intent is I'm just checking off a box, is that enough?
Probably yes for some people, because I think we're rule followers. And, a lot of times, I mean, I'm Reformed. All of this is very deep and heavy for me. And I don't read Hebrew, so please don't call on me. But I have the intention. I might not always have the understanding of what I'm doing, or that my understanding is limited. And I think that's okay, because we all come with a different depth of understanding.
Great, thank you, Kathy. So I think it's really important here right, how we're defining intent. And I want to just offer it. Bill, I haven't forgotten about you. Which is to say that I think the power of intent here, we're defining it as, am I aware that I've done an action that fulfills a mitzvah? Right? So even if the intention is, I'm doing a mitzvah, I don't care if it's meaningful, it's still an intention, right? I'm doing it on purpose. The question is, if I've done something on accident, does that count? And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. Bill Schwartz.
Yeah, my hand doesn't stay there, it goes away, so I can't help it. But anyways, what I wanted to say is, if you hear the shofar blown by a non-Jew, does it count, or does it have to be blown by the proper person?
This whole section of Masechet Rosh Hashanah is all about shofar, and maybe we'll dig into it even further. But it's also another good question, which is the principle that shows up in the Talmud and in Halacha more broadly today, which is often someone who is obligated themselves are the only people who can fulfill someone else's obligation. That has been used to force women away, for example, from doing mitzvot. I don't happen to fall into that camp. I think we're all obligated, and therefore women can do all the mitzvot that anyone else can do, or non-binary folks or whatever. And so I think the question of, can someone who's not obligated fulfill our obligation, is a challenging one. Rabbis generally, as a principle, say one has to be obligated to something in order to fulfill someone else's.
So
right?
the answer is no.
Probably not. There are probably exceptions to that rule we could come up with, we could study in the Gemara, and maybe we will. But in general, the principle would suggest otherwise. Ron, and then we're going to read a little bit more.
I would expect that there needs to be either intent or at least understanding of why you're doing something in order for it to count. Because, I mean, as Kathy was saying, well, it's just a tradition that we do this. Well, it's a tradition that we cut off the end of the roast because it doesn't fit, because the joke is that it doesn't fit in the pot. You know, so I mean, that's, if it's that kind of a thing and you don't know why you're doing it, how could it be a mitzvah to do it?
Right. So Ron, I think, and I'm glad we've started to get some camps here, right? Which is, I think it sounds like you would disagree with Rava, which is that intent does matter, right? Doing the thing doesn't by itself, even on accident, doesn't count.
No, I said intent or understanding. Okay,
fair enough. Okay, let's Nelson, I did see you, but I want to read a little bit more and I'll come back to you. Can I get a volunteer, somebody who hasn't spoken or read yet, perhaps to read this objection to what we've learned so far? Anybody want to volunteer? Yeah, iPad S. Kleiner. Hold on. Yeah, go for it.
I see you.
Because you're on your iPad. Maybe if you click the image that I'm sharing, it might make it larger.
Okay.
Right.
Where am I reading?
Right here. Read this paragraph.
Okay. The Gemara raised an objection to this conclusion from what we learned in a Mishnah. If one was reading the passage of Shema in the Torah and the time of reciting Shema arrived, if he focused his heart, he has fulfilled his obligation. But if not, he has not fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara reasons, what? Is it not that he focused his heart to fulfill his obligation? And if he failed to do so, he has not fulfilled his duty, therefore implying that the fulfillment of mitzvot requires intent?
Awesome. Read this one last paragraph here. I know it's hard because they're different pages.
Okay. The Gemara rejects this argument. No, the Mishnah means that he intended to read the passage. The Gemara asks in astonishment, to read? But he is already reading it, for the Mishnah explicitly states, if one was reading in the Torah, the Gemara answers, we are discussing one who was reading from a Torah scroll in order to correct it, uttering the words indistinctly. The Mishnah teaches that if such an individual intends to articulate the words correctly, he has fulfilled his obligation.
Amazing. And what was your name? I'm sorry.
Stuart.
Stuart. Thank you, Stuart. Now I don't have to call you iPad.
Good.
Thank you, Stuart. So,
Sure.
okay, I wanted to read both halves because this is a very strange piece of text, and I was digging into the Rashi, and Rashi also has a weird understanding, which is what Rabbi Steinsaltz is reading into it. So let's unpack this. So here's an objection to Rava's idea, right? So the rabbis, this is what I meant by when we were reading something more technical this week, which is, right? So we have a premise. Rabbis say Rava, the premise is mitzvot do not require intent. And so now the rabbis are going to go back and try and argue the case, because I think that they do think that intent matters, and they're trying to prove it. And so they're going to go through a bunch of different arguments to try and knock down Rava's argument. We'll see whether or not it succeeds. I'm just telling you what I think. I think, like, the rabbis don't say it explicitly, but I think they're trying to prove that Rava is wrong. So let's find out. So we raised an objection. That is this word, ative. If you see this word ative, you know an objection has come to the previous thing, right? So we talked about vahatanya, introducing a question. Ative is introducing a challenge. Okay, so now we have the scenario in a Mishnah, right? So it's an authoritative source. Someone is reading the passage of the Shema in Torah, and it happens to be the time that Shema is recited, right? You're reading the section in Deuteronomy in which the Shema shows up at the time that you would be reciting the Shema more generally. And it's here, the word is kiven libo, right? Focused one's heart, which is the word kiven, is the word for intend, right? Kavana, right? If I'm intending with my mind and my heart, yatsa, they fulfilled their obligation. But if not, im lav lo yatsa, they did not fulfill their obligation. So it would seem to say from this Mishnah, if I'm reading the text of the Torah, and it happens to be Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it's the Shema, and it's the section of the time to read the Shema, it seems to say that this Mishnah would argue against Rava, that intention does matter. And so then we get this funny paragraph from the Gemara that says no. And I got to tell you, I spent some time with this. It's a little wacky, and I'm not sure that I totally 100% like it. Ooh, bless you. But we're going to sit with it anyway. The Gemara says no, because that seems so clear to me. The Gemara says no. The Mishnah means to say that they intended to read the passage, which is to say, well, I wrote this down in my notes so that I could to talk about this, which is to say that they were intending to read it. The Gemara says, well, they were already reading it. That's what it means. It says it explicitly. The Gemara answers, one who is reading from a Torah scroll in order to correct it. That's all it says in the Gemara. Rabbi Steinsaltz reading Rashi into it, which is to say that if they were just mumbling to themselves and they weren't really saying the words because they were going through and just sort of, they weren't doing it with the intention of reciting the Shema, but rather they were doing it because they were just reading and they weren't really reading it. You know how sometimes when you read something, you're sort of just mumbling, you're not actually saying the words? Rashi seems to say that that's what it meant. And so therefore, if you're reading it articulately, meaning so you're actually saying the words out loud, that's enough to fulfill the obligation. Now, again, does the Gemara exactly mean this? It's unclear. That seems to say what Rashi seems to say, and we're going to read it in the notes here as well, because the notes were really helpful. That's why we have it. Okay. While it is not entirely clear how Rashi understands this, the case being discussed, most commentaries hold that this is the case of one who is reading in order to correct the text and not in the usual manner, right? So you're not just reading it, you're doing it for a different purpose. Rabbeinu Hananel and many others say that. Instead of focusing on the pronunciation of the words, the person is focusing on the way in which the words are written, right? Whether or not that counts as intention is an interesting question. Therefore, this cannot be truly considered reading. Meaning, say, if I'm sounding it out and I'm just focusing on pronunciation, perhaps that's not enough. I'm not sure that I would agree, but that's interesting. The Ritva, who's a Rishon coming many centuries later, on the other hand, explains that one who is reading in order to correct the text must be viewed as acting unawares, since their mind is focused on correcting and not on reading. Therefore, the reading is not a conscious act. It is as if they are performing an unrelated act, while simultaneously reading unintentionally. Meaning to say that if you're just saying the words and they're like letters, you're just sounding out, it's like reading a language, just reading it, saying the words, but not really for the purpose of reading it out loud. You're reading focused closely on the pronunciation of the letters or the shape or whatever. It's not enough. Now, again, I'm going to point out that I actually don't agree with that, but let's beat this text up together. Nelson, Ron, and then Bob.
Well, the way I was reading the whole section was that the intention wasn't to beat people over the head for failing to fulfill mitzvot. The intention was to get them to do more. And when we get to this Gemara, someone who's capable of correcting a Torah scroll, we expect much more of. And so we make much more explicit demands on that person. While someone who maybe is not capable of that, the mere fact that they mutter the words would be enough.
Meaning to say, obligation is like a sliding scale, right? If your capacity is greater, then your obligations are greater. Yes, is that what you're arguing, Nelson?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the rabbis do have a principle sort of like that, which is that you can't transgress a sin you don't know exists. But as soon as you know about it, then you become liable for it. It's not exactly the same as what you're saying, Nelson, but it's similar, right? Which is, I'm doing the best that I can. That should be enough, right? Nelson, thank you for adding that. Ron, Bob, and then Bill said.
I was going to go to he wasn't reading it to correct it, but reading it because he was the Baal Koreh and he was laning for somebody's aliyah, or it was in a class like this and we happened to be studying that text. Now, does that count? And if it does count, why do we then repeat the Shema another time in the service where we're going to do that aliyah? Why don't we skip it that week? Why do it twice?
Right. So I think I didn't look back at the original Mishnah being referenced, but I also understood it the way you did, which is it was just the Torah reading of the day. It just happened to be, maybe they didn't do Shema that morning, it was enough. And then we actually see this principle elsewhere in which if you haven't done, the blessing over the studying of Torah in the morning, but you do the paragraph Ahava Rabbah before the Shema, that counts as saying the blessing from before. You don't actually need to go back and say, the study of text, La'asok b'divrei Torah. So there is a funny thing happening here. I find this rejection to be kind of wonky, and I'm not sure that I like it. We're not going to spend a lot more time with it. I'll give everybody a chance to speak who wanted to speak, but this is a little wacky. Bob and then Bill.
So I'm doing the Amida, and I'm going as fast as I can so that I can keep up with services. And I'm mispronouncing a word that nobody else is hearing. Do I get credit? That's one. Number two, I was told that if you're doing your tefillin in the morning and you haven't had your tefillin inspected recently, and that there are cracks in the letters inside the parchments in the tefillin, that you don't get credit for having put the tefillin on. And I think the intent, to me, the intent fulfills the mitzvah, even if technically you don't, but then who's keeping the scorecard?
Yeah. Those are great questions, which is to say, right, who's keeping track? Like if I did everything in my power to do the best I could, isn't that enough? Right? And the question of, right, who's keeping score is a great one. I love the framework of mitzvot as invitations, right? They're encouragements, they're opportunities, and that we do the best we can with what we have. And so I don't have answers to your questions. They're good ones. I think those are challenging, good theological wrestling that we can do, which is, if I do the mitzvah without intent, does God care? And if I do sort of the mitzvah, or the mitzvah as best as I can, but not entirely, but with intent, does God care? Those are fundamental questions, right? Theological questions, and good ones. And I wish I knew the answer. Hashem hasn't let me know as of late what the answer is. Bill Satin.
So some of this at least sparked in my mind the idea of the time sequentialness, or time proximity of the intent and the action. And I came up with a silly example. If I was going to have a corned beef sandwich on Tuesday, well, I would have had to fulfill the requirement of selecting only animals that I know are kosher. I would have had to slaughter it in advance. I had put it away in my refrigerator. But on Tuesday, when I go to eat it, do I have to be eating it with the intent of that mitzvah, or can I just be happy that I'm enjoying the sandwich in the moment? I mean, so perhaps this gentleman woke up in the morning and said, "Oh, you know what? I'll be reading the Shema as part of my Torah work today. I'm so happy because it will coincide with me being able to recite it." And yet, that could be hours away, time away. I'm not so sure about the time, because intent, I've always thought of intent in these cases, it's the thought you have right before an action. And if they're disconnected, if there's a time separation, how can you claim the intent and the action are linked? But anyhow, I just throw that out there.
Yeah, so time is definitely a factor, and that comes up a little bit later in the Gemara. So hold on to it, because we're going to do it. So we're not going to have time to finish it today, which is great, but I do want us to read this paragraph, because this paragraph that we're about to read is the preeminent example of this principle of whether or not it requires intent. This is the example the rabbis are having in mind when it comes in the halacha later. This is the example it comes with. So it's introduced with tashma. Okay, it's different types of sort of objection. It means come in here, right? We're about to make an objection, right? We learned in the Mishnah elsewhere, if one was passing behind the synagogue, or one's house was adjacent to the synagogue, and that person heard the sound of the shofar, and then a similar category of the sound of the scroll of Esther, right, of Megillat Esther. If one intended their heart, right, they have fulfilled the obligation. But if not, they have not fulfilled their obligation. So here's the counterpoint to Rava, right? And here's the thing it says at the end, right? What is it not that the person focused their heart to fulfill the obligation, and if they fail to do so, they have not fulfilled their duty? Therefore, implying not what Rava said, but rather that the intent does matter. Fulfillment of mitzvot requires intent. Meaning to say, if I just so happened to walk, when I lived in Pittsburgh, I used to live a 6-minute walk from the shul, and the window, the sanctuary was nearby. If I happen to just walk by, happens to be a time in shul, I decided to sleep in, I'm not going to shul or whatever, and I walk by and I hear the shofar. And in that moment I said, I haven't heard shofar yet today. This is going to count for my mitzvah of hearing shofar, right? According to this Gemara, if I do that, my mitzvah is fulfilled. And then, of course, the question that Bill Schwartz asked, whether or not it's the right blast. Let's assume it's the right blast for now, right? If I walk by the shofar, the synagogue, and I hear the shofar sound, but it doesn't, I'm like, oh, interesting, there's a shofar, and I don't register that it's my intention. According to this text, it would say I have not fulfilled the obligation of hearing the shofar. This seems to reject what Rava says. Rava seems to say, you heard it, you heard it. Doesn't matter if you intended it. You heard it, you heard it. What do people think about this example? You can see that the Gemara is not going to like it at the bottom, but what do people think about it? People agree? Disagree? Yeah, Bill.
I think we're, in the case of a mitzvah in which you're doing an action and it's observable by the community or others, and you can tell that something was done, that's different than this. You have no way of knowing completely, not just intent, but what they've heard or what, it's all in their head. This is all in their head. And that's different than a mitzvah where, there's a demonstrative outcome. And so I don't know if all cases are the same. And in this case, where it's all in your head, if the rabbis have already said, it's only God who can tell your intent anyway, well, maybe they've got to back off and say, if you said you did it with intent, just like if you said you were insane before and you didn't have intent, then that's good enough for us.
Right. It's clear that this intent is not something that's measurable by others, right? This is something that really only you know, right? And here we're sort of objectifying it. We're making it objective by saying, it's measurable in some way, but not really, right? Ron and then Nelson.
I think this is actually a bad example. Oops.
Sorry, go for it.
I think this is actually a bad example because I don't know how you could accidentally be walking behind the synagogue just at the right moment and still have intent.
Have intent or not have intent?
To have intent, and you have intent to hear it, and you're accidentally walking there behind the synagogue at the right moment. That's not intent to me. It accidentally worked out, but it wasn't intent. Right.
So I think the Gemara is saying, in that circumstance where you accidentally walked past, or let's say you just live nearby and you hear the shofar, in that moment, it depends on what you're thinking. That's what it's suggesting. Nelson.
Well, I don't know. I have an Orthodox son who's always berating me for my behavior. And part of it has to do with the fact that sometimes I'm a bad example. I'm a bad example because I'm Jewish, and people know I'm Jewish. That I have to have a higher standard in public. So this person doesn't in any way provides actually a bad example because it suggests that you just go for a walk and you can fulfill lots of mitzvot. We want them to do more than that. And one of the things we want them to do is not lead people who don't like Jews to say, "Hey, it's another Jewish thing."
Right. So first, two things. One is, I think it is the responsibility of every child to nudge their parents. So regardless of context. Second, that's right. It's an interesting, right? We're imagining a scenario who has made the choice not to be in synagogue when they're blowing shofar, right? It could be morning minyan in the month of Elul, could be Rosh Hashanah, could be end of Yom Kippur. Whatever reason, they're not in shul, right? And therefore might sort of transgress the principle of marit ayin, of confusing someone because of their actions, right? Of doing something that appears to be problematic, right? It's an interesting dynamic, right? It doesn't show up in the conversation of intention, but perhaps their intention is different. It's an interesting question. Bill Schwartz and then Stuart.
Yeah, if let's say you're walking along the street and you lose $5 and you don't realize you didn't lose $5 and till maybe later, and then a poor person or best picks it up and he uses it to buy lunch. Does that fulfill your obligation to give tzedakah?
That would fall into this same category, right? Or even to make it more specific, right? If I lose $5, I had it in my pocket and I get home and it's gone. And I say, you know what? Whoever finds it, that'll be tzedakah for them, right? Does that count as tzedakah? Or does it have to be something more specific? That's a good, you're all collectively, you're so good at coming up with these, the scenarios and the question. I don't know the answer. It's a good one. Stuart.
Yes, Rabbi, we're wrapping things up. We're out of time here. I have a couple of questions. Would it be okay if I emailed them to you?
Yes, I'll put my email in the chat.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, that was it. Thank you.
Awesome. So I'll end with us here, and people should feel free to send me an email. So I'll stop sharing and the screen because we're not going to read any more text. I want to say two things, and then we're going to pick up next week. First is intent is more complicated than it appears, right? We often talk about kavanah, intention, as sort of this like easy to understand principle that like, I do something, I intend to do it, done. But it's clear that it's not as simple as that. And what we haven't talked about, and it isn't in this section, is like, are there different intentions matter, right? Bill Satin, you made that reference, right? Do different intentions make a difference? I know a few others made that point as well. So that's the first point, right? The intention is more complex than it appears. And two, we're starting to get to understand what the rabbis think about mitzvot, right? That there's a sense of obligation, that there's a sense of clarity as to I've done this or I haven't done this. And we all know that it's actually a lot fuzzier along the edges, both of these principles, than it appears on its surface, which is that there are lots of like the framework of God commanding us is a complex one to start with, right? That there is some sort of objective measure that we've done it or not done it, right? We haven't even talked about what happens when you go above and beyond. Lifni mishurat adin, as Rashi says, right? Beyond the letter of the law, right? And the fact that intention is a factor at all, right? If I do the right thing at the right moment, is that enough? We're not going to resolve any of those answers today. We will pick this up again next week, Thursday at noon. I hope all of you have a wonderful Shabbat, and I hope that you've had a wonderful week. And we'll see you next week. Be well, everybody.